Hello, good evening, and welcome to De Montfort University and to the International Centre for Sports History and Culture's first event for cultural exchanges. I'm Professor Martin Polley. I'm the Director of the International Centre for Sports History and Culture here, and it's a real pleasure to work with cultural exchanges again. We've got a long record of putting on events for this wonderful student-run festival, and we're delighted to be able to make that happen in this online version this year too. And I'd formally like to thank Nuala Tague, Gemma Kibble and Craig Appleby for making this evening's event possible, and also to Tony Graves, who oversees the entire Cultural Exchanges programme. The International Centre for Sports History and Culture is one of De Montfort's unique specialist research centres, now in our 26th year. And we have a fantastic track record in teaching, research, dissemination and public events around a whole range of aspects of sports history. And one of our key strengths is in our world-leading research that our colleagues carry out. And what we're doing today is to come together to celebrate 3 new books that are the latest outputs of that fantastic research record. So we're going to be celebrating them and their authors in a moment. What we'll do is each of our 3 speakers will say a little bit about the book on their own. We'll then have some general discussion, and then we'll go over to the audience questions, which would be great to see so many questions come in advance. So thanks very much for your attention. Thanks for your questions. And we look forward to the next hour exploring these 3 great new books in sports history. But first off, I'd like to bring in my colleague, Neil Carter. Good evening, Neil. So Neil is a senior lecturer in the International Centre for Sports History and Culture here at De Montfort, and he's also the programme leader for the MA in Sports History and Culture. He's the author of many articles, and he's the author of books, The Football Managers, and also A History of Medicine, Sport and the Body, A Historical Perspective. And tonight we celebrate his new book, which he's got ready to show us here, called Cycling and the British, A Modern History, which has just been published by Bloomsbury. So Neil, thanks very much, and over to you to give us a bit of an overview and a taste of your book, please.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So Cycling the British. Well, essentially, the book is looking at the place of cycling in British society since the 19th century. And cycling has meant, throughout this period, different things to different people at different times. And the book attempts to understand why people rode bicycles in certain activities, and also why they didn't ride them during this period. And so politics and pleasure really are at the centre of the book. The scope of the book, it's quite ambitious. It's looking at the development of British cycling from its origins in the 19th century to the present, and it looks at a variety of forms of cycling, sport, touring, leisure, and also cycling as a means of transport, and tries to understand how these activities have kind of ebbed and flowed over that period. While cycling has been a persistent part of British life, it's never been a consistent one. There's always been ebbs and flows. Perhaps I should say a bit about the origins of the book. Well, I first got the idea to write this book nearly 20 years ago now. I'd been asked by Richard Holt to do some research on Tommy Simpson, and the archive I used was the Modern Record Centre at University of Warwick, which hosts the National Cycle Archive. So I was aware that there was this huge and very impressive archive at Warwick. And once I found the time to develop this idea, I was also jumping on a bandwagon at the time, because 2012 is when I really started the research, and this was when Bradley Wiggins was the first British cyclist to win the Tour de France. And so so yes, there was that sense. I was like I said, jumping on this bandwagon. So the book itself, well, it's underpinned by a number of themes. One of them is that it's the idea that riding a bike is a political act in many ways. Most people don't ride a bicycle for political reasons, consciously anyway. But riding a bicycle has been both connected with politics with a small p and a big P. So for example, in the 19th century, cycling was wrapped up in debates, political and legal debates over its legality. And it wasn't until the Local Government Act in 1888 that cycling became a legal carriage of the road. And in many ways, that determined many of the ideas of what cycling meant to people, certainly people who were running the sport and the activity up until the mid 20th century. And this, the politics regarding cycling also came was seen in a debate over cycle paths in the 1930s, where there was a lot of opposition to cycling on specially constructed paths. You may think this is strange, but again, this goes back to the 19th century, where it was all wrapped up in the political culture, really, of cycling, and what people thought cycling was about. It was about, really, many people thought it was that cyclists should be free to cycle wherever they could. And then by the 70s, cycling, the bicycle itself becomes a symbol of environmentalism, and in many ways that has continued today as we see cycling again part of the shift in political debates regarding the environment and also climate change. So that's one of the main ideas around cycling. Another one is about the changing values of the middle classes. How in many ways, the development of cycling has been how the middle classes have really been at the forefront of its development, particularly from the 19th century. And in many ways, once a car culture becomes embedded within British society, so it's from a negative position that the middle classes are shaping cycling's development, and again up into the 21st century, where cycling again is much more becoming a middle class activity. So there are a couple of the big ideas from the book, and it covers sport as well, particularly the shift from the emphasis in sport on the time trial to mass start racing and the debates over that, and in the mid 20th century. So I think that's a summary of the book. So back to you, Martin.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Neil. So really great stuff there. I think there are some fantastic themes there, particularly around politics and class. What we're going to do, everyone, is each of the three speakers is going to do a little bit like Neil just did there, and then we'll move into questions. So working strictly alphabetically, let's move next to Heather, Dr. Heather Dichter. Heather is assistant professor here in the International Centre for Sports History and Culture, and she's got her book nice and ready long before we need it. Thanks for that. And she's the program leader for our Sport Management Masters. She's written widely on sports, diplomacy, and international relations in a wide range of journals. And she has, even before today's solo edit book, she's co-edited key works including Diplomatic Games, Sports, Statecraft, and International Relations since 1945, and a book with Bruce Kidd, Olympic Reform 10 years later. And Heather, in our second Cultural Exchanges event, Heather will be hosting an in conversation with Bruce tomorrow evening. So if you haven't already booked on that, please do so as soon as our session tonight finishes. So her new book, which she's been holding very calmly there for 5 minutes, is called Football Diplomacy, or in certain territories, Soccer Diplomacy, International Relations and Football Since 1914, published by the University of Kentucky Press. So Heather, can you give us an overview of your work, please?
Thank you, Martin. So my book, Soccer Diplomacy, International Relations and Football Since 1914, is an edited book. So I wrote the introduction, and I have a chapter based on my own research on East and West German relations during the Cold War. But there's chapters from 8 other scholars, another kind of second introductory chapter from a diplomatic historian who doesn't work on sport, that really, from seeing all the chapters in this book, really speaks to wider scholars about the importance of soccer diplomacy. And then a conclusion from noted scholar, Professor Peter Beck, an emeritus professor now. He wrote Scoring for Britain over 20 years ago now, and he's kind of come back to the field to conclude this book. And this book kind of came about a little bit differently than I think my 2 colleagues' books, in that it came out of a conversation with an editor with one of the presses. And there's been a lot on sport and diplomacy. I've written a lot on sport and diplomacy. A lot of other people have. And he kind of said, what about a book just solely focused on soccer diplomacy? It is the world's most popular game and sport. And so it really made sense. There actually were quite a lot of people working on soccer and diplomacy. And so that's kind of how this book came about. And so the chapters in this book focus on what you could call soccer diplomacy or soccer as diplomacy. So soccer diplomacy would be that way of how governments use soccer as a means of public diplomacy, if you will. And this could be via players, via teams, individual matches or games themselves, tournaments, or even tours. Whereas soccer as diplomacy is kind of more how federations engage and negotiate with governments, other sport bodies, businesses, the media, all to produce and manage actual sporting events. So these are obviously quite linked together, but these are kind of the 2 big concepts that kind of underlie the different chapters in the book. And the book has a real geographic spread, which I'm really happy about, that it shows that this concept of soccer diplomacy is used really all over the world. And it's not just by the countries that are powers on the pitch, or the countries who are kind of diplomatic and global powers, but really every country around the world is using soccer as this kind of concept, as part of its diplomacy. So it can be from states who are quite powerful diplomatically and not so powerful, not so good on the pitch, countries that don't really have, we don't really think of them as having much of a diplomatic standing, and they might not be great on the pitch either. And all of these countries are using soccer diplomacy, which I think is really amazing and exciting, and comes out in this book. And I'm also really excited that you'll see is, the subtitle is Since 1914, and what it shows is that this concept of soccer diplomacy is something that's been happening for more than a century now. We often think a lot about sport and diplomacy as being, really kicking off, especially after the Second World War. Once the Cold War really gets underway, sport becomes such an important element of that. But what this book shows is that this has been happening since before the Second World War, really starting, in fact, really during the First World War, at least with the chapters that are in the book. And it really shows that almost every major kind of issue of the last 100 years, and soccer plays a part in it. So chapters in this book deal with fascism, with the Cold War, the Vietnam War, apartheid, the rise of the BRIC states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, dealing with corruption. So, all of these big issues of kind of the world they reappear, or they appear within soccer. Soccer appears with them. And I think what also really comes out of this book, and it's something, I didn't really realize until I was writing the introduction after all of the chapters had been gathered together, was just how important tournaments play in these concepts of soccer diplomacy and soccer as diplomacy. Almost all of the chapters in the book deal with some sort of tournament. They might not all be the World Cup. They might be continental, regional tournaments. They might be smaller tournaments. They might be professional clubs, not necessarily for national teams. But tournaments really play a huge part of soccer diplomacy. And so that's kind of what came out of putting this book together, and the concepts where, each scholar wrote their own chapter on their own. I didn't give them much guidance other than the book on soccer and diplomacy. But in the end, I think what's really great is how many common themes come out of this book, and really show the power of this one sport within the world of diplomacy.
Okay, rookie error. I do apologise. You wouldn't think I've been teaching online for nearly a year, but I still managed to forget to unmute myself. I'm really sorry about that. I was simply thanking Heather for that, and looking forward to now introducing our third speaker, Professor Matthew Taylor. So Matt is Professor of History here at De Montfort and in the International Centre for Sports History and Culture. He's a social historian with a huge range of expertise in sport and recreation and many things beyond, including labour and trade union history. And he's the author of The Leaguers, The Making of Professional Football in England, 1900 to 1939. He's co-author with our colleague Pierre Lanfranchi of Moving with the Ball, a book on the migration of professional footballers. And he's the author of The Association Game, A History of British Football. And his new book, which he's about to model for you now, is called Sport and the Home Front, Wartime Britain at Play, 1939 to 45, published by Routledge. So Matt, if you'd like to take us through your highlights, please.
Thanks very much, Martin. Apologies, by the way, everyone. I've got a slight cough, so if I need to use my water, just bear with me. So I wanted to start the book with a kind of Dominic Cummings style incident, which actually starts the introduction to my book. So in early March 1942, a National Fire Service football team from Bolton travelled 280 miles to Dumfries to play in an inter-regional cup match. Now, the game made front page headlines and caused a mini political storm. What was the reason for this? Well, the team had travelled in a fire service vehicle at a time when there was a great deal of anxiety about wasting of resources, including petrol, and the value of something as trivial as sport at such a pivotal stage of the war was questioned. So the political reaction to this incident sums up many of the tensions and complexities relating to sport in Britain in World War II. Sport was encouraged by the government as a source of physical recreation and morale, but even so, it was often downplayed and marginalised, meaning that the case for sport during wartime was never won. It had to be consistently asserted, revised, and reframed according to circumstance and context. And this really sums up one of the book's main arguments, that the treatment of sport was complex and contested throughout the conflict. So why did I come to write the book? It goes back 10 or more years in a way. But really there were two reasons. And I think it was partly that I felt that there was nothing that had been written significantly on sport in the Second World War. And that comes both from the history of the home front and from the history of sport. Historians of the home front tended to ignore sport. A lot of people went back to Angus Alder's famous book, The People's War, from the late 1960s, where there's a few paragraphs on sport. And that for a long time was the most detailed account. And and it hadn't really been added to. Even when research on other areas of culture and leisure, things like cinema, music and art were increasing, and they've increased a lot in the last 20 or 30 years or so, sport seemed to be ignored. As far as historians of sport are concerned, they similarly tended to kind of sidestep the Second World War. And there's a number of reasons for that, possibly. I think one of them is simply that the Second World War was regarded as a kind of interval in the narrative of 20th century sporting history. So what this book tries to do is really explore a gap in our understanding of the social and cultural history of the war and in the history of sport. So in doing that, there's a kind of a number of themes which kind of form the basis of the chapters. It looks at government attitudes to sport, and that's kind of its starting point, and how they kind of change over time. Here, the second chapter deals with sport clubs in wartime and the kind of logistics that were involved in whether to carry on or not. The third chapter looks at the whole issue of kind of space at a time when lots of grounds were requisitioned by the government, and that there were limits on space because playing fields and sports grounds were used for were used in different ways for food production. Those are all quite significant factors. And the fourth chapter deals with the connection between sport and fitness and things like this. And the final three chapters kind of move on to look at the representation of sport. There's a chapter which looks at kind of diaries and autobiographies and how that affected kind of everyday life. Then there's a chapter which looks at broadcasting, kind of radio and broadcasting, and how that represented sport. And finally, the final chapter kind of looks at, it brings everything together and looks at the way in which war, sport, and the nation were encapsulated, and how that developed over the 6 years of the conflict. So overall, the book is then about not just what happened in the Second World War, but also in what it represented and what it meant to people. Okay, what it meant to people when they were playing, when they were watching, when they were listening, and then when they were reading about it. And it argues really that during the war, sport came to be increasingly regarded as a characteristic of Britishness. Not everyone agreed on what Britishness meant, but still it was associated with Britishness, a kind of symbol of nationhood. For clubs, carrying on became a kind of sign of patriotism and good citizenship. For ordinary people going about their everyday lives, sport provided a break and a distraction, and it boosted morale. Yet at the same time, when ordinary routines could be kind of celebrated as patriotic acts, I think what the book argues is that sport arguably mattered more than it ever had done before. Okay, so that's my summary of the book. Back to Martin.
Thank you very much. I remember to turn my mic on again there. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Matt. I must say that paragraph in Angus Calder, reading it as an undergraduate, that was my first way into sports history. I'm sure plenty of people of our generations found it in that way as well. That's really great stuff. Thanks very much to all three colleagues there for giving those quick overviews. What I'd like to do now is to invite all three back into the room. And I'm going to start off with a couple of questions that really go to all three of them. And then we'll move over onto the questions that have come in from the audience. So that's great. Thanks. So I think that one of the first things that really struck me listening to all of them, really obviously through Matt's, pretty clear in Heather's and Neil's as well, is that there's an awful lot of contemporary resonance in the history that you've been writing or editing and what's going on right now. The obvious one with Matt is obviously a time of in some ways an interval between normal sport and hopefully normal sport again in the future. Can I ask each of you to just sort of reflect on that a little bit? What kind of, as you were researching, as you were writing, even in the gap between finishing the writing and coming to publication, what kind of connections were you making with what's going on out there in the real world? Whoever wants to go first, unmute and jump in.
I can start. And I think this is a great question, and something I was working on as I was writing the introduction, and then absolutely as I was editing it, and then when the copy edits came in, was pretty much 11 months ago, as the world was 11.5 months ago, as the world was shutting down for the pandemic. And I think, with soccer, there's a lot of stuff in the 2018 World Cup and surrounding it, which, it was one of those. I was definitely revising the intro during the tournament. Obviously with the poisoning that the British government said no government ministers, no royal members would go to Russia for the 2018 World Cup. With a few years ago, Saudi Arabia led a blockade of Qatar. That has impacted some kind of regional tournaments that's recently been lifted. So I think there's definitely, who knows what's still going to happen in the lead up to the 2022 World Cup, or what will happen there. And with the pandemic as well, it brought back examples of a few years ago with the Ebola crisis in Western Africa. There was a lot of issues with continental tournaments and athletes, teams not being able to go to other tournaments, or countries not wanting certain teams coming from their country and then getting in trouble. So I think there's quite a lot that constantly happens, and it's something where I think there's a lot more to be written about soccer diplomacy, as it just keeps being so relevant, quite frankly.
So being rewritten on a daily basis. Matt, how about yours? What did you reflect there?
Yeah, no, in a sense, I kind of hinted at it, didn't I, with the kind of Dominic Cummings reference? But yeah, absolutely. Oddly enough, when I was writing the book, it did seem I wasn't thinking so much of the contemporary resonances. I was thinking about the way in which this is a particular chapter which hasn't been understood as much as it needs to be, and how actually it connects the pre-war and post-war. If we just look at a sports history narrative alone, it kind of connects them in a way we need to connect them, and we kind of need to understand that interval was a period of change as well as continuity, and it was meaningful in that sense. But obviously, since kind of finishing the book, which almost happened at the beginning of I finished the book slightly before the beginning of the pandemic, but then it was going to come out around that time. It was immediately that the connections were what to do with sport, what do we do, what is the cultural significance of sport at a moment like this, all those sorts of things. And it becomes, of course, the context is different, but so many of the discourses and narratives are similar, and they tell us something about the difference in what fits now from where it used to. But
we're losing you a little bit there, Matt. What I'm going to do, I'm going to move on to Neil, and then Matt, just come back. You're back with us, Matt? You okay? I'll move on to Neil then, and maybe we can come back to Matt there. But I think we've got a great sense of the links he was making. Neil, how about you for cycling? Very different, because it's just one sport, whereas Heather is obviously using diplomacy as the big lens, and Matt, multiple sports across one period of time. What did you find any contemporary resonances while researching yours, or indeed between finishing writing it and publication?
Well, in some ways, history was taking place as I was writing it. I kind of got the idea. I started really researching in 2012, jumping on that kind of bandwagon. But yeah, there was a boom to a certain extent, still is a boom in British cycling, which was both from a sporting context and a leisure context, but also you could see how cycling was moving up the political agenda in many ways. It was linked to what wider political angles, policies such as transport, infrastructure. In some ways, that think about it now, it kind of informed what I wrote about as well. I mean, it got me to thinking about how these issues had been dealt with in the past. So there was, in that sense, the contemporary was was shaping the past, or shaping my writing in that way.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Obviously, we've got a slight technical problem with Matt, but we're working on it behind the scenes. So we'll keep going with Neil and Heather for now, and then Matt can catch us back up when he rejoins. There's one other theme I just wanted to pick up before we go to the audience questions, and that's about women and sport. So obviously, within the centre, we've been doing a huge load of work recently on gendered histories of sport. We've been running events around women's sports, past and indeed futures, with workshops on leadership aspirations. We've got some really great PhD work going on a range of women's approaches to sport, and it would be really interesting to hear from all three of you, but both of you who are on screen at the moment, about ways in which you have explored the theme of gender or not within the books that we're looking at today. So Heather, or maybe Heather, you start as Neil's just spoken, and then we'll come to Neil.
Okay, great. That's actually a huge hole within this book of soccer and diplomacy. It's not that people aren't writing about soccer, women's soccer, because there is quite a lot of scholarship. But what what I think is the case is that the women's game, and especially international tournaments, is much more recent. And as a result, either it hasn't really been used for diplomatic purposes, or if it has, those files, particularly with the different foreign ministries, are going to be closed still for another 20, 30, 40 years. So it's still going to take time so we can really uncover how it has been used. But I think as well, when we look at a lot of the kind of promotion around different women's tournaments, and a country hosting the Women's World Cup, for instance, or the Women's Euros, what we hear is that this is being used to promote and expand the women's game. And we're not hearing the same type of rhetoric around why a country wants to host a women's tournament that we hear with hosting the Men's World Cup, the Men's Euros, or something like the Olympic Games or the Pan Am Games. I hope that I will soon be wrong, and that we will start seeing women's soccer being used for diplomatic purposes or as part of diplomacy. But I think we haven't quite been there yet for a couple of those different reasons. And so that's something that's unfortunately not in this book. And it was something that, I tried really hard to find somebody working on women's soccer and diplomacy, but I think those are the reasons why it's not really being done at the moment.
So that's one for the second edition then, Heather. Neil, how about you? Where does gendered history, and in particular the history of women in cycling, figure in your book?
Well, almost from the start, really, but obviously in different context. So the 1890s is seen as when the bicycle emerges as a kind of symbol of emancipation for women, or middle class women, I should really say. But even before that, there were women. Weren't riding bicycles. They were accompanying their husbands, or on what were known as sociables, these kind of tricycle machines. And there was kind of some gender politics there in terms of that form of cycling. But then you go into the 30s, when there's a real boom in cycling, and this is when in many ways female cycling comes of age, and it's many working class women are riding a bike. On the sporting side, it produces in many ways its first real superstar, Marguerite Wilson, who sets all these long distance records, who's really riding at a level of the vast majority of men can't attain. So for example, she rides John O'Groats to Land's End and it's the fourth best time at that time. And what does the bicycle give you? I mean, it gives freedom, independence to women, able to meet men. So in that sense, it is it's quite an important machine for women in the 20th century.
Thank you. Really, really interesting stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing that develop. Matt, sorry we lost you for a while, but welcome back. Hopefully the tech's okay. So we're just discussing the role of women's sports histories in the projects that you will celebrating today. Talk us through how you've approached this subject in your book on the wall.
Yeah, well, I mean, women. It's really impossible to sidestep the role of women in the Second World War. The historiography deals with it centrally. Women are important. Historians like Penny Summerfield, have emphasised how significant women in all the contexts, as workers, as munition workers, as their role in the family and the home and things like that are central. So in a sense, there was never going to be an issue of women being fairly central to this book. They're important in terms because the government sees them as incredibly significant in terms of war production. So the recreation and leisure of women is extremely important, and the government needs to provide for women in those sorts of senses. And women are important. The voices of women are significant in my book as kind of players of sport, as observers of sport, but also alongside men as people who don't like sport. So there's quite a lot about women who dislike sport and not are not happy with its particular the emphasis placed on it. There's always a decision to be made by historians about whether they deal with particular. I know there's lots of debates about whether you have separate sections or separate chapters. There was never an issue of there being a separate chapter on the role of women here. They were absolutely central and ran through all the themes that I talked about earlier.
Thank you. Really, really good stuff. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move on to the audience questions. Obviously, we had a lot through. We have had to do a little bit of sifting there, but I'm sure everybody will understand. And so the first question we're going to take is one that's come in for Heather. And the question is, it'll be coming up on the screen in a moment, it's Heather. It's about how do you see the influence of football diplomacy changing in the future? How do you see the influence of football diplomacy changing in the future?
So I think this is a great question. And I think that it's just going to be more prominent, more visible, more talked about, and I think what this book uncovers or kind of really brings to the fore is just how prominent it has been. And I think there's so much more research about what has happened in the past. And I think we'll learn as scholars look at, more countries that aren't our soccer powers and that aren't our diplomatic political powers. But I think especially on a regional level, I think there's a lot of research to be done. And I think we might find that soccer diplomacy has been even more important and more powerful for regional relations, maybe outside of Europe, but around the rest of the world. And I think that we'll continue to see that, and that it will just really be incredibly prominent or even more visible going forward.
Great, and adding to your earlier points about how women's football is probably going to come into that matrix more as well. Thank you. The next one coming in from the audience is a question for Neil. Neil, I think this is something you touched on a little bit, but there's a great chance to expand. And that's the question is, has cycling been more popular as a sport or as a means of transport in modern culture? Oh, you're muted, Neil.
As I was saying, in terms of sheer numbers, you would have to say it would be as a means of transport. Of course, it depends what popularity means. In terms of perception, you could say that sport has a higher profile within the media. So it depends how you want to judge popularity. But as a means but in terms of sheer numbers, you have to say means of transport. But again, the context here shifts. It can change over time. So for example, like I said, in the mid 30s, this was really the peak of cycling in terms of a means of transport from the mid 30s to the mid 50s. But then the car begins to kind of dominate, and it was about this time that sport, in many ways, as an activity, it's through its visibility, it keeps cycling in the public eye, because in some ways it could have disappeared as a means of public transport by 1970. And again, in recent years, there's been a small growth in cycling to work, but now you can argue that it's mainly the middle classes who undertake this, and it's the working classes who are driving the motor vehicles. So the context is kind of ever changing.
Thank you. Excellent. Thanks, Neil. Matt, your first question has come in, and that's coming in. It says, what would you say were the key benefits of sport during wartime? Very wide-ranging question there. What were the key benefits of sport during wartime?
So I guess this kind of is right into the debate, which is at the centre of the book in a sense. Why should we continue to play? Should we continue to play? To what degree? And I would say it revolves around three kind of interconnected ideas. So morale is considered a key thing to be able to, and morale is just so important, particularly in the Second World War. The government's obsessed with morale. And so judging how important, a particular event or a particular development is for people's morale is a key. Really, that's the key for why the government is prepared to by and large to support and accept the importance of sport, both at recreational level and at professional level. The second kind of part that's linked to that is kind of welfare, that I've already mentioned something about, kind of the welfare of workers, particularly. War production becomes extremely important, so you need workers who are basically, staying fit, have a form of recreation outside the workplace, and that becomes really significant as well. And connected to that, it's considered a benefit just in terms of taking people's mind off the seriousness of the war. So the notion of triviality and seriousness kind of interchanges at various times. Sometimes there's an emphasis on we need to avoid trivialities, and sport can be an aspect of that. But then other times, we need to embrace them. We need to, at times when things are difficult, we need to focus on those. And so those kind of things kind of interconnect as being kind of considered really, really important aspects of sport in wartime. Many of these things we can say are still significant for sport, at peacetime, but obviously in wartime there needs to be a case made for sport, and those are the three things that are key to it, I would say.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, because the case made all linked presumably to transport, to rationing, to risk of bomb damage as well as we go along. Thank you. Great, we're coming around again then. So the next one is back to Heather. And Heather, I was really intrigued when I saw this question come in. I'm looking forward to the answer. Would you commend any particular organisation for their diplomatic leveraging in football?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I don't know if you'll necessarily like my answer or be as quite interested with it, or a bit of a letdown. I don't really have one that I would say I would commend. I think nothing really stands out, but I also think this is an area where there might be one, but we haven't had that research done yet. And again, I think it might be something more at the regional level where, in fact, some organization, one national, soccer federation perhaps has done a really great job, or perhaps it is one of the kind of regional federations that has taken this action, but nobody's written that article or book chapter or entire book yet. So I think there's not one yet that I'd fully commend, but hopefully in a few years we'll have a better answer because there'll be so much more research.
I'm really interested in the way you keep coming out to the regional level to shift people's attention, and you're also making such a great pitch now for the second edition of this. Neil, your next question is about the future, I guess, in some ways, linking the future and the past. And that is, are there aspects of cycling history that you would like to cover in your future research?
I might just say, give us a break. I've just finished this book. But what was interesting, in some ways, one of the frustrating parts of writing the book, I suppose because you're writing a book over such a long chronological period, you do kind of see the gaps. And so there was a number of gaps that I thought that did emerge during the research. So, I mean, if I was blatantly honest, although it's called Cycling and the British, Scotland and Wales are underrepresented in the book. So I think there's more scope there, certainly, for work on Scotland and Wales. There's potential for looking at subcultures of cycling, so cycle speedway, for example, which was a sport that I hadn't really heard of. And another gap I thought, which I could have covered more, was the sport of cycling in Britain post 1960, with the focus on the domestic scene. I mean, I kind of, in the latter part of the book, I talk more about, in some ways, the international scene, but I haven't got really much on the domestic cycling, and the shift from amateurism to professionalism. I mean, and cycling at this stage, it's still, it's not, even today, it's not really a particularly commercial sport in Britain, but it'd still be interesting to look at the development in terms of clubs, etc.
Great, thanks. I know that whenever you start a book and you think how many words, hundreds of, tens of thousands of words you've got to deal with it, but it's a lesson to everyone out there that there's always stuff that you have to cut and always things that you're going to have to miss out. Matt, the last personal question comes to you, not too personal, I promise, and then we've got some audience questions for everyone. And this is one I know, Matt, we've discussed this a few times, the whole strengths and weaknesses and pros and cons of doing comparative research. And the question that's come in from the audience is leading you exactly down that line. The question is, how did sport in the Second World War compare with sport on the home front during the First World War?
Okay, that's a really big question, and I can only give you a very brief highlight, really, of this. I would refer you, by the way, I've written on this before, so an article that I wrote a number of years ago kind of looks at this. Although at the time, I probably think that I didn't know anywhere near as much as I do now. I guess what I would initially say is that there's this general view in terms of sport that the First World War was a kind of bad war for sport, and the Second World War was a good war for sport. And I think obviously that's far too simplistic, and that's based quite often in both cases on the first year or so of each war, rather than kind of understanding the way in which war changes. So I would tend to say, although there are kind of clear differences, and one of the big differences is that simply sport was much more embedded, I think, as a form of British popular culture by the late 30s than it was in the 14 to 18 period. So for that reason, officialdom and the government were kind of more willing to accept it as being significant in relation to morale and things like that. But in other respects, there are all sorts of similarities. And so, for instance, my story of sport in the Second World War is about the way in which the First World War was used as a model. Despite the fact that lots of sport mistakes were being made, clubs, associations, and even the government actually looked back and said, well, how was this dealt with in the First World War? Shall we do it the same? And quite often they decided initially to do things very similarly. So I think that the connections to them were there. They were lived through the Second World War. The First World War was discussed, in everything. Sport was kind of just one aspect of that. And so in both cases, there was probably a lot more sport than we think there was. That's what, particularly at recreational level. That's another important factor, I think. And in both cases, sport, although the term was used more in the Second World War, was considered very much a source of civilian and troop morale. And so I think I'd emphasise the similarities more than the differences, to be honest.
Excellent, thanks very much. Brilliant. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we've got a couple of audience questions that we thought would be really interesting for all three speakers to answer. And so the first of these is a question that historians love being asked, and it's the one about sources. So the question that's come in is, considering the wide range of sources that you used in your books, or maybe Heather, in your case, in the chapter that you you researched and wrote. Do you have a favourite source or one that was particularly interesting or surprising? And I think Neil has volunteered to go first on this.
Yeah, I think there was. In the Modern Records Centre, there was an unpublished memoir I came across by someone called Arthur Cook, who and his cycling career in many ways spanned most of the 20th century, I think from the 20s to the 80s. And reading it not only was very helpful because it gave you an insight, giving insight into cycling culture, particularly at the grassroots level, at club level. I mean, that's something that I could have, that's still ripe for exploration there. And what it meant to be a cyclist as well, especially during the pre-World War II period. So, and yeah, that gives you a good insight into cycling during that period.
That's great. The sense of the personal can always be such a valuable insight, can't it, to get those individual stories in there. Matt, how about you? Same question. What favourite sources from all the vast number you must have used, and anything particularly interesting or surprising?
People might not be surprised for me to say that mass observation is one of my favourite sources. I'm continually highlighting its use, and I kind of teach students. I do a module which uses mass observation significantly. So yeah, that's a great source because it provides a nice combination of the kind of personal material, and it's just very rare the type of insights that it provides. Even though there isn't a huge amount about sport, you can find it. Aside from that, there's some nice little snippets of things that I kind of only included a little bit, but I'd love to include a lot more. Got some great stuff from the National Hockey Museum, particularly the Women's Ladies Hockey Club collection, which is just brilliant in terms of the Second World War. Just takes you through the everyday things which were so important in terms of this club to these women, and also how they made the club work and how they made it survive in this particular period, including kind of the reusing of the uniforms and various things like that, and the fact that the uniform secretary was the most important person in that club during the Second World War, to make sure everyone, at a time when there were shortages of everything, that everyone had access to enough material, and it was kind of passed around to different groups. So yeah, there's some great stuff in the Imperial War Museum archive as well. So yeah, lots of good examples, I think.
Fantastic. I love that level of the club detail to really bring it to life as to how sport is impacted right at the grassroots level. Heather, how about you? Any particular sources that stand out for you?
So I'm actually going to pick one of the chapters that's not mine, but it's Eric Nielsen's chapter that I thought was such kind of shocking and crazy, and shows that level to which soccer keeps being used and has been. Is his chapter is on the fact that Australia sent the national team to a tournament in Vietnam in 1967. Like, how that was possible in the height of the Vietnam Wars is just crazy. And I think his approach to this chapter, where basically the captain of the team has a memoir, and kind of that's the version that's kind of publicly known in the country. But by him going into the archives and uncovering, in fact, how things actually, it's not what the public memory is, and kind of uncovering this history, I guess, in a bit, or bringing it to light. But then also the challenges that, one of the files is not allowed to be, or isn't declassified, and it's not allowed to be for quite some time still. I mean, there's challenges of kind of like, what else is in this file that would help us really understand this story even more. And so I think it's kind of that sense of like, I can't believe they sent a team, that there was a tournament in Vietnam in '67. And his way, he really unpacked all of those different sources to bring it to life.
Wow, that is truly amazing that such an event would go ahead. That's great stuff there. Good. Right, we're almost out of time now. This has really flown by. It's been so great to hear all the stories here. What we've got is time for one more audience question, which I think can go to everyone again. I think when anyone has just finished one book, the main thing they want to do is sleep for a while. but then they do start thinking about what comes next. So that's the question. What will your next sports history project be? And Matt has volunteered to go first on this one.
Okay, so the thing I'm working on at the moment is a kind of general study of transnational history through sport from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. It's kind of one that doesn't. I got lucky with this because it's not a project which was meant to be focused on primary source materials. So working on that in the current situation is easier than it might otherwise have been. So that's the main thing I'm working on at the moment. And after that, I'm thinking, amongst other things, of doing a broader kind of study of sport and identity in Britain using mass observation as the lens.
You do love that mass observation there, Matt. Excellent. Sounds really, really good stuff. Heather, you're next. What's your next sports history project?
So I've actually just finished my monograph, and that'll be coming out later this year. And that's been my bigger project on the bidding for the 1968 Olympics and kind of international sports Cold War battle with NATO as a whole. And that's where my chapter on East and West Germany and NATO in soccer and diplomacy is kind of a small part, the soccer part of that bigger project. And I think there's still some stuff that didn't make it into that book that will be coming out in the, that I'll still want to get out. But I've also been working kind of finishing up 2 special issues that I've co-edited on the Winter Olympic Games. So I'm really excited for that work to come out, because I think the Winter Olympics just haven't had the treatment of the Summer Olympics or even, FIFA's World Cup. So that's what I've been working on, and hopefully I'll see soon.
Brilliant. Okay, so Winter Olympics all the way there, really interesting. And Neil, how about you? Where do you go after cycling?
Well, there's no real big project in mind at the moment. I was thinking of looking at the relationship between sport and prison. That'll be a future project, and also I might revisit some of the gaps in the cycling archive that I didn't really explore enough.
Fantastic. That's great. The prison one sounds fascinating. I really want to hear more about that. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Heather, Neil, and Matt, for taking us on this whistle-stop tour through your new publications. And thanks very much, members of the audience, for your attention and your time and for your questions. And thanks again to Craig, Nuala, and Gemma for the backroom work there. It's been great to hear this work. I very quickly want to trail a couple of other things coming up. So the International Centre for Sports History and Culture runs a series of webinars, and you can just Google that and you'll find us. We've got one coming up in mid-March and another one in April, then we'll have a whole new season next year. But much sooner than that. And while you're in the cultural exchanges mood, tomorrow evening, Heather, can you remind us what time it starts?
6 p.m. British time.
6 p.m. British time, thanks for that. Heather will be chairing an in-conversation with the absolutely amazing and totally inspirational Bruce Kidd, Canadian athlete, Olympian, scholar, activist, advocate, you name it, he does it. And so Heather will be chairing an in-convo with Bruce Kidd here on Cultural Exchanges. Starts 6 o'clock UK time tomorrow. Bruce will be joining us from Canada, so the time won't be quite so great for him, I'm imagining. But there are still some tickets available, so please go on the Cultural Exchanges website after you leave here and book in on that. But for us, for the 4 of us from the International Centre for Sports History and Culture, we'd like to thank you again for your time. And it's been great to meet with you today, and we'll see you again in the future. See you soon.